I remember the phone call that triggered it all, the morning light catching specks of dust in our living room. My wife, Valerie, had left for work already, and I was enjoying a quiet cup of coffee when the phone rang. On the other end was her old friend, Jade, stammering through a half apology, half confession. She mentioned an incident she'd witnessed months ago, something Valerie promised wouldn't matter. The cryptic tone set my heart pounding. I had trusted my wife completely, never doubting our strong marriage. Yet this call suggested a hidden fracture, something that would soon shatter our world. I hung up, a cold sweat trickling down my spine. Jade had hesitated to share specifics, but the implication was clear: Valerie had strayed. I recalled stray hints over the past months, late nights at the office, vague excuses about urgent deadlines, and the sharp scent of cologne that once clung to her jacket. Each time, she dismissed my concerns, assuring me nothing was wrong. Now, Jade's call confirmed my darkest suspicions. Still, I needed hard proof before confronting my wife. I felt oddly detached, as though watching someone else's life crumble. Perhaps I was hoping this was all a misunderstanding. That evening, Valerie came home looking exhausted. She offered a perfunctory kiss on my cheek, muttered something about a stressful day, and retreated into our bedroom. I pretended everything was normal, even though my mind was spinning. Over dinner, she seemed distant, responding only with nods or single-word answers. I longed to ask who she'd been with during those late nights, but fear of her response silenced me. I replayed Jade's call repeatedly, dissecting every uneasy pause. The question echoed in my head: what if Valerie truly had been unfaithful? The dread gripped me, yet I needed more concrete evidence. A week crawled by, marked by sleepless nights and stilted small talk. Valerie's phone habits changed. She guarded it fiercely, even taking it into the bathroom. When I asked about her day, she delivered rehearsed answers, eyes flitting away. I confided in my best friend, Marcus, who urged caution. He suggested I confront Valerie or hire a private investigator. I felt torn. Part of me ached for the truth, no matter how painful. Another part of me prayed I was wrong, clinging to a fraying hope that Jade had misunderstood. Yet every sign screamed otherwise, fueling my growing suspicion relentlessly. At last, my suspicions collided with opportunity. One evening, Valerie abruptly announced she had to work late again. Something in her eyes betrayed anxiety, and I decided this was my moment. I followed her discreetly, trailing behind at a safe distance. My heart thudded as her car led me not toward her office but to a small motel off the highway. She parked, glanced around nervously, and hurried inside. I waited, pulse hammering, until I saw a man approach, glancing at his phone before entering the same room. The sight gutted me. Clearly, this wasn't an innocent after-hours meeting. I wanted to burst in, confront them both, demand an explanation. Instead, I drove home in a daze, uncertain how to process the scene. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. Every memory of Valerie's affection now felt tainted. I reminded myself that I needed more than a glimpse of them entering a motel room. If she dared spin this into a misunderstanding, I had to gather undeniable proof. The next morning, I forced a polite tone over breakfast, asking about her evening. She stared at her cereal, mumbling vague excuses. My anger simmered, but I held it back. Over the next week, I repeated my secret vigil, following Valerie whenever she claimed late work. Each time, she ended up at that same motel with the same man. I took photos, capturing their stolen embraces in the parking lot. It was painful but necessary, each click of the camera burning my soul. I felt disgusted at the duplicity, yet a strange numbness settled over me. Confrontation was imminent, but I dreaded it. I'd never imagined our life would unravel like this. When Valerie returned at night, she wore a forced smile, acting as if nothing had changed. One evening, after she slipped into bed, I found myself pacing the living room, unable to sleep. My thoughts circled endlessly. How could she betray me? What had I done to drive her away? My reflections led me to recall our difficulties conceiving children, the strain it placed on our relationship, and her lingering sadness. We eventually adopted a beautiful little boy named Oliver, transforming our home into a family haven. Yet beneath that joy, perhaps resentment festered. Still, none of it justified her affair. As night stretched on, I realized I needed answers directly from her lips. The next morning, I requested Valerie sit with me at the kitchen table. She looked apprehensive, as if sensing what was to come. My heart thundered in my ears, but I confronted her gently at first. I explained that I knew about the motel, that I had photos. Her eyes widened in shock, tears brimming instantly. She tried to speak but no words came, only choked sobs. I felt my anger flare, though I attempted to remain calm. Eventually, Valerie managed to stammer, "It didn't mean anything." The phrase hung in the air, twisting my heart. How could it be meaningless? I pressed her for details. How long had this been going on? Who was he? Did she still love me? At first, she refused to answer, apologizing repeatedly. Finally, in halting phrases, she admitted the affair began 6 months prior. The man's name was Paul, a coworker from a different department. She insisted it was physical only, a misguided outlet for her frustrations and insecurities. She swore she loved me, that she never intended to hurt me. Every word felt like a fresh wound. My mind buzzed with confusion, torn between rage and the remnants of my love for her. I demanded she end it immediately, to which she tearfully agreed. I told her I needed time to decide whether I could forgive her. Valerie crumpled at my feet, sobbing that she'd do anything to make it right. I felt pity mingled with disgust. That night, we slept in separate rooms. The following days were tense, both of us walking on eggshells. Valerie tried to prove her devotion by constantly checking in, texting me every hour. But trust was shattered, and her presence only fueled my anger. I wrestled with the question, could our marriage be salvaged, or was this final? Then something unexpected happened. Valerie confessed she believed Paul might be Oliver's biological father. I stared at her in shock, barely registering her words. Oliver was adopted, but we had used a private agency that allowed open adoptions under certain conditions. Yet Valerie's revelation suggested something else. She insisted I'd misunderstood, that it wasn't about actual parentage. But my mind reeled, suspicious of every claim she made now. Why mention Paul and Oliver in the same breath? Could she be implying a deeper secret, something involving Oliver's origins? She backtracked quickly, saying, "Forget I said anything." But the damage was done. Haunted by Valerie's slip, I began to question Oliver's adoption story. We had limited information, the mother was young, uninterested in contact. Oliver's father was absent, details unknown. However, the timing matched suspiciously with Valerie's affair. My imagination churned, conjuring scenarios of Paul actually being Oliver's father. Yet that seemed impossible. Oliver's adoption had been finalized over a year before the affair allegedly began. Still, the seed of doubt was planted, and I couldn't ignore it. I decided to pursue a DNA test, not even sure what I was looking for. Maybe I hoped to prove Valerie was lying. I collected a sample from Oliver discreetly, swabbing his cheek with a cotton swab while he played. Guilt twisted my stomach, knowing my son was oblivious to my suspicions. Once Valerie was out of the house, I gathered a hairbrush she used, carefully extracting hairs that might still hold follicles. The plan was uncertain, but I found a reliable lab online and mailed off the samples. The waiting period was excruciating. Valerie noticed I was withdrawn, but attributed it to the affair. We exchanged stiff small talk, rarely making eye contact. Each day, I dreaded the lab results more. As days turned into weeks, I tried to focus on Oliver's well-being. He was a bright, loving child, with an infectious giggle that often brightened our home. Yet now, every time I looked at him, I felt an unsettling twinge of fear. What if his origins were tangled in Valerie's betrayal? I reminded myself that I loved Oliver unconditionally, that no test could change that. Still, I was desperate to uncover the truth behind Valerie's cryptic hint. Did she fear that Paul was in some way connected to Oliver? Or was she confusing timelines out of guilt and shame? Finally, the results arrived in a plain envelope. My hands trembled as I opened it alone in our bedroom. I scanned the paper, trying to decipher its technical jargon. Then I saw it, a probability of relationship. According to the DNA analysis, there was a 99.9% likelihood that the hair sample was directly related to Oliver's DNA. My breath caught. This implied Valerie was Oliver's biological mother. My mind spun. We had always believed Oliver's birth mother was a stranger. Yet the test suggested otherwise. The words blurred, and I found myself rereading them, heart hammering with disbelief. I sank to the bed, stunned. If Valerie was Oliver's biological mother, that meant our entire adoption process was a lie. Or, at the very least, severely manipulated. All the documents, the legal proceedings, had she forged them? How had she convinced me, and everyone else, that we were adopting from an unrelated woman? My thoughts ran wild, conjuring scenes of behind-the-scenes bribery or false identities. I felt betrayed on a level I couldn't fathom, not only as a husband but as a father. How could she hide something so monumental? I closed my eyes, frustration and hurt swirling inside. Confronting Valerie felt like facing an avalanche. She spotted the envelope in my hand and froze. I told her the results, voice shaking with anger. She collapsed into sobs, admitting that Oliver was indeed her biological son. She had conceived him before our marriage, but gave him up for adoption, hiding the entire ordeal. Later, guilt consumed her. She orchestrated a plan to readopt him into our family, forging documents so I'd believe we were adopting a stranger's baby. She feared losing me if I knew the truth. Her explanation poured out, twisted and unbelievable, but heartbreakingly real. I stared at her, barely comprehending. Oliver was hers by birth, and I was his adoptive father, unwittingly adopting my wife's child. The irony felt suffocating. She claimed the affair with Paul had no connection to Oliver's birth, that she'd lied in a moment of panic. But my trust in her words was decimated. How many layers of deceit was she hiding? She assured me Paul wasn't Oliver's father. I demanded proof. She hesitated, then revealed Oliver's biological father was an old flame named Carter. She insisted it was a one-night stand before we even started dating. Everything spun madly. I felt my world collapse under the weight of Valerie's secrets. She had manipulated the adoption process, robbed me of the chance to willingly raise her son, and lied about everything. She kept repeating, it didn't mean anything, the same phrase she used to describe her affair. Apparently, she believed that if her intentions were good, giving Oliver a stable home, her deceit was justified. But the betrayal cut deeper than words could describe. Our marriage was built on half-truths, illusions of transparency. I could barely stand to be near her, fury and heartbreak warring within me every time I saw her. For a brief moment, I considered leaving immediately, packing my things and disappearing. But Oliver's face flashed in my mind. Despite the lies surrounding his adoption, he was still my son in every way that mattered. Abandoning him would punish only an innocent child. So, I stayed, although I moved into the guest room. Valerie tried to apologize, begging for forgiveness. I told her we needed professional help, couples counseling, maybe even legal guidance. The maze of forged documents, hidden paternity, and her extramarital affair was overwhelming. She nodded through her tears, promising to do whatever it took. We began therapy sessions, a tense process where Valerie finally admitted the extent of her deceptions. She described meeting Carter, discovering her pregnancy, panicking, and placing the baby for adoption under a false name. By the time she met me, she'd all but buried that chapter of her life. Guilt consumed her when she realized I wanted children. She located Oliver through unofficial channels and arranged his adoption, forging signatures to hide her identity. Hearing this in a therapist's office felt surreal. Part of me admired her twisted dedication, but mostly I seethed. She'd robbed me of informed choice. In subsequent sessions, our therapist probed the reasons behind Valerie's affair with Paul. She confessed it stemmed from fear of exposure and a need for validation. She believed Paul offered a temporary escape from her guilty conscience. The explanations never soothed my wounds. I demanded a paternity test to confirm Carter was Oliver's father, wanting to ensure there were no further lies. Valerie agreed, albeit with visible dread. The test confirmed her claim, revealing no relation between Paul and Oliver. It was a small relief, but the damage to our marriage was colossal, the foundation cracked beyond easy repair. Each evening felt heavier than the last. Valerie tiptoed around me, cooking meals and trying to show affection, but I remained distant. Oliver sensed the tension. He'd ask why Mommy and Daddy weren't smiling as much. We tried to hide our conflict, but children are perceptive. He'd crawl into my lap and ask for stories, seeking comfort in a routine that felt shattered to me. I loved him so desperately, yet I fought resentment towards Valerie for weaponizing his adoption. I wanted to shield him from the ugly truth, but the strain of secrecy weighed on us all. As weeks turned to months, I considered whether I could truly forgive Valerie. She had lied for years, betrayed me physically and emotionally, and endangered my bond with Oliver. In therapy, she admitted she never expected her lies to unravel this brutally. Part of me recognized her remorse was genuine, yet the enormity of her deception loomed. One day, after an especially volatile session, I told Valerie I wanted a legal separation. Her face crumpled, but I felt a grim resolution. Trust was a fragile thing, and she'd smashed it repeatedly. I needed space to decide my path forward. I moved into an apartment nearby so I could still see Oliver often. Valerie insisted we co-parent, which I agreed to, if only for Oliver's well-being. Explaining my move to him was agonizing, but I carefully framed it as Daddy needing some grown-up time to think. He didn't understand, tears wetting his cheeks as he clung to me. Leaving that night was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. At the apartment, loneliness closed in. The silence reminded me of all I'd lost, my home, my illusions, the woman I thought I knew. I wondered if love could survive betrayal. In the following weeks, Valerie sent text after text, apologizing and sharing updates about Oliver. My anger flared whenever I heard her name, yet I remained cordial for Oliver's sake. I found some solace in focusing on my work, pouring myself into projects that kept my mind occupied. Marcus invited me out for drinks, but I often declined, not ready for social engagement. Instead, I spent evenings alone, rereading the DNA test results and adoption papers. I kept asking myself, if Valerie had just told me the truth from the start, would I have willingly adopted her son anyway? Deep down, I suspected the answer was yes. Oliver was a joy, and had I known the full story, I might have accepted him regardless. That realization fueled my bitterness toward Valerie. She had robbed me of the chance to choose, subverting our relationship's honesty. Meanwhile, therapy continued, sometimes with both of us present, sometimes individually. Our therapist encouraged me to express my rage in a controlled setting, acknowledging my heartbreak. Valerie wept often, insisting she'd do anything to repair the damage. I felt torn between love for our family and an overwhelming urge to never trust her again. One day, Oliver drew a picture of our family, me, Valerie, and himself, all holding hands under a bright sun. The simplicity of his vision tore at my heart. For him, we were united, unconditional in our love. Seeing his innocent portrayal made me question my resolve to remain apart. Could we rebuild for his sake, or was that a recipe for further pain? I wrestled with guilt, worry, and longing. Memories of happier times snuck up on me, moments when Valerie's laughter would light up a room, and Oliver's first steps had us both cheering. Had all of it been fake? I reached a breaking point when Oliver, during a weekend visit, asked if Mommy could come watch his soccer practice with us. He looked so hopeful, clutching his tiny cleats. I couldn't bear to refuse, so I agreed. Valerie arrived at the field looking nervous, but Oliver beamed. Watching them together, I felt a swirl of emotions. After practice, Oliver bounded up, dragging Valerie and me by the hands. In that fleeting moment, it felt almost normal, like we were a united family again. My defenses wavered, replaced by a flicker of longing for the life we once pretended to have. That night, I lay awake replaying the scene. The quiet joy on Oliver's face, the shy smile Valerie cast me, it all gnawed at the fortress of resentment around my heart. Could I ever move past the betrayal, or would it define our relationship forever? Marcus advised me to proceed carefully, warning that repeated deceit can't vanish overnight. Yet part of me yearned to try, if only to salvage the family Oliver believed we were. Eventually, I called Valerie, proposing a joint session with the therapist to discuss possible reconciliation steps. She agreed instantly, voice trembling with cautious hope. During that session, we laid everything out. I confessed the depth of my pain, how I felt robbed of honesty and choice. Valerie spoke of lifelong shame over her concealed pregnancy, how fear drove her to lie. She acknowledged that her affair with Paul was a cowardly attempt to escape the guilt and tension at home. We discussed conditions for moving forward, complete transparency, ongoing counseling, and a commitment to rebuilding trust. It was daunting, but for Oliver's sake, we decided to try. The therapist reminded us healing would be slow, with setbacks along the way. We nodded, determined but uneasy. I gradually spent more time at the house, though I kept my apartment lease month to month. Valerie removed every lock from her phone, handing me access to her emails, texts, and social media. She changed her work schedule to avoid any overlap with Paul. I could see the toll it took on her, but I remained cautious. Late at night, we'd sit at the kitchen table, sometimes talking in hushed tones about our future. Other nights, silence enveloped us, the weight of unspoken doubts pressing down. Oliver, sensing a shift, grew more cheerful, blissfully unaware of the fragile state of our reunion. Trust, once shattered, is difficult to piece back together. Days passed without major conflict, but small triggers sparked my anger, a passing mention of her job, an unexpected text alert. Valerie tried her best to reassure me, often overcompensating with affection. Some nights, I recoiled, memories of her betrayal flooding my mind. But other times, I let her hold me, craving the familiarity of her touch. I realized that forgiveness wasn't a single event, but a series of choices, repeated every day. Whether I could keep making those choices was a question I couldn't yet answer with certainty. We continued therapy, delving deeper into the adoption deception. Valerie explained how she'd been certain I'd reject her if I knew Oliver was hers. She dreaded reliving the shame of her past, so she spun a story that felt safer. Hearing her reasoning didn't erase my hurt, but it offered clarity. She was broken long before I met her, and her lies were a misguided attempt to protect what we had. Over time, I realized I still cared for her, that underneath my rage and sorrow was a vestige of love. However, acknowledging that love was only the first step. Months slipped by, marked by slow healing. Oliver's laughter filled the house again during my visits, and sometimes I'd stay overnight, sleeping in the guest room. Valerie never pushed me to share her bed, respecting my boundaries. The tension ebbed, replaced by cautious warmth. We planned small family outings, trips to the park or local museums, and for those moments, everything felt almost normal. Yet, in quiet times, the memory of her affair and her elaborate fabrications still haunted me. I was learning to live with the scars, but I wasn't sure if I'd ever be whole again, or if we could. One evening, after Oliver fell asleep, Valerie and I shared a rare, genuine conversation about the future. She spoke of her commitment to honesty, how she recognized therapy was an ongoing necessity for her. I admitted that I missed the intimacy we once had. In a burst of vulnerability, she asked if I'd consider moving back in. I hesitated, old wounds stirring. But I also acknowledged that staying halfway between separation and reunion wasn't sustainable. I told her I'd think about it, and she nodded, tears in her eyes. Our journey was precarious, but maybe that meant progress. A few days later, I went to gather more belongings from my apartment. Standing amid the half-packed boxes, I realized how draining this limbo had become. Oliver's drawings covered the fridge, pictures of the three of us smiling bright. I understood that either I'd recommit to our marriage wholeheartedly, or I'd walk away for good, granting us all closure. That night, I returned to the house, sat Valerie down, and told her I was willing to move back in, under certain conditions. We'd continue therapy, maintain open communication, and she'd never again hide anything about Oliver's past or her own. Valerie agreed without hesitation, relief washing over her features. We embraced, and though it felt tentative, there was genuine warmth. I moved my belongings back the following weekend, Oliver squealing with joy. The initial days were awkward, like learning to coexist anew. We tiptoed around each other, trying to avoid reigniting past conflicts. Occasionally, I'd catch her eye and see profound regret. She sometimes woke from nightmares, calling out apologies. I'd hold her, reminded that I was not the only one in pain. Her self-loathing ran deep, the consequences of years of deception crushing her spirit as well. Life regained a semblance of routine. We cooked dinner together, discussing Oliver's school projects and scheduling therapy sessions. Gradually, I allowed myself to enjoy small moments of closeness with Valerie, holding hands during an evening walk, sharing a light joke, or cuddling on the couch while Oliver played. Though the wounds ran deep, these gentle interactions signaled the possibility of healing. I began to realize that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past, but about accepting it and finding a way forward. For Oliver's sake, and perhaps for my own, I was determined to see if our marriage could emerge stronger. Months passed, and our relationship continued to evolve. Valerie's affair with Paul now felt distant, a scar but no longer a bleeding wound. She had no contact with him, a boundary I enforced rigidly. Meanwhile, the mystery of Oliver's adoption was laid bare, and we updated our legal documents to reflect the truth of his parentage. I signed as Oliver's adoptive father with newfound resolve, no longer in the dark about his origins. The shame of the deception lingered, but transparency offered a sense of liberation. Together, Valerie and I navigated the aftermath, day by day, seeking mutual understanding. Our therapy sessions shifted focus toward strengthening communication. We learned to voice concerns before resentment brewed, encouraging honest dialogue even when it was uncomfortable. Valerie expressed remorse daily, but I asked her to channel it into consistent honesty instead of repeated apologies. Slowly, I noticed a change in her, a willingness to face difficult truths rather than hiding. She refused to say, "It didn't mean anything" ever again, recognizing how it trivialized the gravity of her actions. The phrase still haunted me sometimes, echoing in my memory, but I fought to replace it with healthier patterns of reassurance and trust. Finally, almost a year after I first discovered her affair, we reached a pivotal moment. One night, while Oliver slept, Valerie approached me with tearful eyes, handing me a small box. Inside was a new wedding band. She explained she wanted a fresh symbol of our vows, a tangible reminder of our renewed commitment. My chest tightened. I recalled the day we first said, "I do," never imagining such betrayals and upheaval would follow. Yet here we were, still standing, still fighting for our family. With trembling hands, I took the ring and slid it on, tears burning my eyes. In that moment, I chose forgiveness, not the naive kind that forgets pain, but a forgiveness that accepts our history, scars and all. We embraced, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I sensed genuine unity. Valerie's lies, her affair, the DNA test, they were chapters in our story, not the ending. Oliver's laughter still filled our home, and now, a soft hope dared to bloom between us. Though we'd never reclaim the innocence we once had, we could forge a more honest bond. And in that quiet moment, I believed, however cautiously, that we just might succeed. Today, I look back on the day I confronted Valerie's affair, the revelation of Oliver's true parentage, and the destruction that followed. It all seemed insurmountable then, a cataclysm set to obliterate our future. Yet somehow, we persevered. Our story stands as a testament that sometimes healing arises from devastation, provided both parties are willing to confront their darkest truths. Valerie and I remain vigilant, guarding our renewed trust with sincerity and consistent honesty. We've learned the hard way that, it didn't mean anything, can't erase pain, but shared resolve can nurture hope. And for Oliver, that hope is everything.